For the first time, as I stepped on Soviet soil, I felt myself a full human being. A full human being.
I am not a front runner politically. In cases where I lent my name, it would be to Martin Luther King.
Paul Robeson was once called the giant of the Harlem Renaissance, a bass voice that shook continents, an irreplaceable symbol of freedom, intellect, and struggle. But few know that behind his glittering fame lay a life crisscrossed with wounds, hidden corners never brought to light, and an abandoned 6,500 square foot mansion in Englewood, New Jersey. Have you ever heard of that house? It's the place where the FBI planted listening devices, where Paul Robeson once sat writing a suicide note. And in the living room, a secret still waits to be unveiled. Now, in today's video, join me as we uncover the story no one has dared to tell about Paul Robeson and the abandoned mansion that holds a century's worth of pain. Let's start with the place that captured both the glory and tragedy of Paul Robeson, the historic Englewood Mansion. It seemed like it would be his final sanctuary, but instead, it became a witness to years of torment, surveillance, and a slow descent into forgotten shadows. June 5, 1941. After a tour that electrified Europe, Paul Robeson, the man hailed as the voice of humanity's conscience, returned to America. He was no longer just an artist, he was an icon, a black man who dared to stand before the British Parliament and speak of justice, who sang in Russian in Moscow's Red Square, who declared that black people are not tools for entertainment, but human beings with ideals. But in the America of that era, a black man who was too prominent, too brilliant, too international, was also a threat. Amid a barrage of press scrutiny, covert FBI surveillance, and threatening letters, Paul Robeson knew he needed a place of true peace. A place to protect his family, a place to prepare for another battle, the quietest, most enduring one, being smeared and erased. And so he and his wife, the writer and activist Islanda Good, decided to buy the mansion in Englewood, New Jersey. It was a neoclassical home, 2 stories tall, with an English-style gabled roof, spanning roughly 6,500 square feet on a 1.5-acre estate. The purchase price back then was $26,000, equivalent to over $500,000 today, paid almost entirely in cash. When the realtor handed over the contract, Robeson shook his head slightly. "I don't want to sign any more papers with this government," he said, as if foreshadowing the tragedies that would later unfold in his life. The mansion boasted 7 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, a discreet wine cellar, a slate-lined tennis court, and most notably, a glass-walled music room where Paul's bass voice once echoed through early mornings. The oak-floored study was where he penned his famous speeches against fascism and demanded equality for black people. On the frame of the second-floor bedroom door, Paul hand-carved the words, "To be or not to be," a question that never found an answer in his life. From 1941 to 1949, the house was a hub for the black intellectual movement on the East Coast. Islanda hosted afternoon teas with writers like Langston Hughes, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Lorraine Hansberry. In the garden, Paul Jr. played under the maple trees, quietly noticing the strange cars that often parked outside the gate. Only later did the family learn those were FBI agents posing as mail carriers. Today, the Englewood Mansion still stands, but in ruin. The gray-black roof tiles are rotting, the window frames are cracked, and weeds choke the stone-paved walkway. There's no for sale sign, no clear owner on record. Local residents say a few investors have visited over the years, but they all left quietly. Some claim they felt watched when they stepped inside the mansion. Since that day, the iron gates of the Englewood estate have been locked once more, and a new layer of dust continues to settle over its untold history. Paul Robeson's story isn't just written on stages or in political arenas. It's etched into every wall, every weathered wooden door of that house. And perhaps only by returning to this place can we truly understand. The glory of a man can also be the spark of his greatest tragedy. But before the Englewood Mansion became the vessel for such lofty dreams, Paul Robeson's life was already forged by profound losses from his earliest years. Spring 1898, in a weathered house in Princeton, New Jersey, a cry rang out under the dim glow of an oil lamp. That was Paul Leroy Robeson, the youngest child of a poor black family, born with a proud lineage in his veins. His father, William Drew Robeson, was an escaped slave from the South who became a pastor at Witherspoon Church. His mother, Maria Louisa Bustle, was a Quaker-descended teacher who taught literacy, morality, and above all, kindness in an unjust world. When Paul was just 6, fate took his beloved mother away. A sudden kitchen fire claimed her life. The blaze didn't just destroy their small home, it left a void in the boy's heart that could never be filled. They say that after that night, Paul stopped speaking for days, clutching a singed handkerchief, the only thing left of his mother, which he kept as a talisman for the rest of his life. The tragedy didn't relent. In 1909, his father was forced out of Witherspoon Church for daring to challenge the unspoken rules imposed by the white lead board. From a spiritual leader, he became a laborer, quietly bearing the weight of life with grueling manual jobs. The Robeson family was forced to leave Princeton, drifting through small towns like Westfield and Somerville, surviving on the meager coins their father toiled for daily. For Paul, those were unforgettable years. Meager meals in damp boarding rooms, the sound of his father's sighs after a long day pushing carts, and the dimming eyes during late nights reading the Bible together under flickering oil lamps. Then, one winter morning in 1914, just a year before Paul entered Rutgers University, William Drew Robeson collapsed on the steps of a small church where he often prayed alone. His heart stopped in the cold, unseen by anyone. Paul, only 16, ran to find his father's body already cold, his brown hat rolling nearby, and his Bible still open to Job 1:21. Through these relentless tragedies, Paul Robeson lived in restless nights. In recurring dreams, night after night, he saw himself in a grand house with green gardens, a library, and peace. That was the first and forever image of the Englewood mansion, a place where, years later, he would try to make his childhood dream real. But it was also there that everything he held dear would crumble, one by one. From the pain of losing his mother in a fire at 6, to the silent gaze beside his father's coffin, ousted from his church for his skin color. Paul Robeson grew up with wounds that never healed, but from those very losses, he forged an iron will. If the world silenced black voices, he would sing louder, speak bolder, and make the whole world listen. In the fall of 1915, at just 17, Paul became the 3rd black student in Rutgers University's history and instantly became a star. On the field, he was an All-American footballer, an unstoppable giant. In the classroom, he was valedictorian, a Phi Beta Kappa scholar. But no glory came easily. Once, as a black man, Paul was beaten bloody in the locker room after football practice. He stood up, wiped the blood, said nothing, and the next day took the field with a fire that burned the stadium down. That was the first time people saw it. Paul didn't just play, he fought. In 1921, during a rehearsal for a student play, Paul met Eslanda Cardozo Good, a brilliant chemist with captivating eyes. Those eyes saw in Paul not just an artist, but a torch ablaze. They married, and she became his partner, manager, and silent witness to a monumental yet tormented life. From 1924 to 1930, Paul took to Broadway's stages. With his warm bass voice, he didn't just sing, he touched the pain of his audience. As Joe in Showboat, his rendition of Old Man River rang out like a cry for a people drowned in history's river. It wasn't a character. It was him, a black man rowing through a century, bracing against prejudice, but never stopping his song. By the 1940s, Paul was no longer just an artist. He became an international icon, an unyielding giant. His Old Man River was no longer a lament, but a call to resist. On Broadway, he played Othello with a force never seen before, a historic 296 performance run that shattered racial barriers in a white-dominated art world. Now he was a film star in Sanders of the River, a host of intellectual tea parties with Eslanda. But it was also then that rumors of an affair with co-star Peggy Ashcroft began to surface. A quiet crisis in his marriage erupted. That night, in June of 1941, the small apartment in Kensington felt swallowed by a thick, suffocating darkness. A desk lamp cast a faint yellow glow over unfinished newspaper pages. But Eslanda's eyes were fixed on a crumpled brown envelope, its shaky handwritten line reading, "Ask your husband where he was last night." Inside was a short, anonymous letter, brief but sharp enough to pierce her heart. There were no tears, no sobs. Only a silence so complete it felt like the stillness of a lake before a storm. She set the letter down and slowly opened the worn leather notebook where she had written her thoughts, clipped articles, and recorded Paul's speeches. Her hand trembled slightly, but her handwriting remained firm as she wrote each word with quiet conviction. He is the light, and I will not let that light go out. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a vow, a declaration that she would protect not just the man, but the dream they shared. A dream of justice, of dignity, of a world without color lines. Eslanda didn't cry that night. She simply closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and drifted into sleep like a soldier readying for the next battle. And so, that complex, tangled relationship failed to break the will and belief Eslanda held for her husband. That was also when Paul and Eslanda decided to buy the Englewood mansion. That day, he pulled a stack of cash from his vest, slammed it on the table, and bought the house like it was a fortress, a refuge for a soul exhausted from proving he deserved to live as a human. On their first night in Englewood, Paul stood alone in the glass-walled living room, opened the window, and looked out at the garden. A breeze lifted the curtains, and his mother's handkerchief fluttered off the table like a silent. But it was in this very mansion just a few years later that fear took root. A true tragedy was looming. In 1949, after a concert in Peekskill, New York, a racist mob attacked. Paul's car was pelted with stones, fans were beaten, and he narrowly escaped with his life. Returning to Englewood that night, Paul sat dazed on a garden bench, the wind rustling through silent branches, the house behind him eerily still as if it dared not speak. From the moment Paul Robeson publicly spoke out against racial discrimination, opposed war, and defended the Soviet Union during the Cold War, a dark, invisible shadow began to loom over him. It wasn't just suspicion, it was an entire system of power ready to crush a black man who dared to step outside the lines. In 1950, at the height of his fame, the U.S. government abruptly revoked his passport, citing threats to national security. This wasn't just an attack on his civil rights, it was a suspended sentence hanging over his career and his life. Paul, who had once performed in dozens of countries and represented America on international stages, was now barred from leaving the very borders of his own country. From that point on, every door slowly closed. Television networks blacklisted him. Concerts scheduled months in advance were suddenly canceled due to political pressure. His bank accounts were frozen and placed under surveillance. On one occasion, when he tried to withdraw a small amount to pay his son's tuition, he was told, "The system is currently reviewing your data." In the Englewood estate he once dreamed would be his peaceful haven, even neighbors began to treat him with caution. And worse, according to several accounts, the FBI planted listening devices in his oak-paneled study, the very room where Paul had spent countless hours writing speeches, composing music, and reliving the ideals that had lifted him to greatness. From a global icon, Paul Robeson was gradually reduced to a prisoner in his own home, not because of any crime, but because he had been too brave in speaking the truth. All the pain, frustration, and exhaustion he had suppressed for years nearly erupted on one early winter night in 1952. After an intense hearing before the House Un-American Activities Committee, where he was interrogated like a criminal instead of a citizen, Paul quietly returned to his Englewood home. He didn't turn on the lights. He walked into his familiar study and sat at the oak desk. On it lay a blank sheet of paper and a black fountain pen. His hand trembled as he removed the cap. The night was suffocatingly silent. The thought of writing a farewell letter had haunted him for years, and now it almost spilled into words on the page. But just as the tip of the pen touched the paper, he stopped. Soft footsteps echoed behind him. Eslanda, his thin but steel-strong wife, stood silently in the doorway. She said nothing, only glanced at the crumpled sheet in the trash bin, then walked over to the window. The room fell still again, filled only by the gentle whisper of wind through the panes, like a silent prayer. After that night, the Englewood estate was no longer a sanctuary. It became a gilded cage. Paul began to hear strange hang-up calls, unfamiliar footsteps outside, and the faint metallic clicks of surveillance that seemed to monitor every breath. No one saw the exact moment he fell, but from that night on, the light in his eyes was forever dimmed. Eslanda continued hosting civil rights meetings at the house, shielding Paul from the press, the public, and his deepening depression. Meanwhile, their son, Paul Jr., grew up quietly in a world like no other. Some nights, he hid in the living room, crouching behind the sofa, listening to his father sing old songs. Englewood wasn't just a home, it was a portrait of an era, the place where Paul Robeson reached his peak and also where he fell, not because his voice faltered, but because an entire system decided he didn't deserve to exist. As the last flickers of hope began to fade in the Englewood mansion, Paul Robeson entered the harshest chapter of his life. The years of glory, struggle, and hope now echoed only in the past. In 1958, after nearly a decade trapped in the very nation he once sang for, the U.S. Supreme Court restored Paul's passport. He returned to the stage, performing in England and Australia, but audiences no longer saw the vibrant giant of old. Ravaged by depression and exhaustion, Paul agreed to electroshock therapy in a London hospital. The brutal treatment stole not only his physical health, but also the light in his eyes. 3 years later, in 1963, he returned to America, but not to fight on, to retreat. He lived in seclusion in a shabby apartment at 4951 Walnut Street, Philadelphia, with his sister, Marion Forsyth. The narrow 3-story unit had creaking wooden floors and pale light filtering through worn curtains. He received no visitors. He avoided television. He answered no letters. That closed door seemed to bury one of the 20th century's mightiest voices. In 1965, once again, anguish tore Paul Robeson apart from within. Eslanda, the steadfast partner, the fierce companion through every battle, passed away from breast cancer. He wasn't there in her final moments, not because he didn't want to be, but because he couldn't. Since the early 1960s, after years of psychological isolation, Paul's health had severely deteriorated. He was diagnosed with cerebral circulatory disorders and chronic depression. His family had no choice but to place him under medical care, first in London, then at a psychiatric facility in Switzerland. The electroshock treatments there, though hailed as advanced, only further shattered his already fragile mind. Meanwhile, Eslanda was battling cancer back in New York. Even in treatment, she fought to keep Paul's name alive in the public memory, through lectures, writings, and their shared fight for human rights. Despite the distance, they exchanged short letters, holding on to the thread of their bond. But over time, miles turned into silence, and silence became an unbridgeable void between two once intertwined souls. When Paul received the telegram announcing her death, he stood silently in the living room of his Philadelphia apartment. He gripped an old handkerchief left to him by his mother, once a cherished keepsake in the Englewood estate. His eyes fixed on nothing, his voice gone. And in that moment, he knew a precious part of him was gone forever. After Eslanda's death, Paul relied entirely on his sister and son, Paul Jr. The Englewood mansion, once alive with intellectual gatherings, music-filled nights, and debates about justice, was no longer home. Harlem was no longer a refuge. Paul was left with little more than a few $100s, scattered music royalties, and a vast spiritual legacy. Beneath the heavy gray mist blanketing Philadelphia on the morning of January 23, 1976, no one knew that a once world-revered icon was quietly drawing his final breath. In room 214 of Presbyterian Hospital, Paul Robeson passed away in silence, surrounded by cold white walls. By his bedside, his sister Marion held his hand, as if trying to transfer warmth from a heart that had already run dry of tears. At the foot of the bed stood Paul Jr., his only son, wordless. But there was one thing no one else knew. Tucked beneath the worn coat Paul had brought with him into the hospital, hidden deep in the innermost pocket, was a letter, sealed, unsent, and addressed to the FBI. Written in 1973, the letter accused his longtime family physician, who had been treating him since the 1950s, of being planted by a government agency to monitor him and manipulate his prescriptions, pushing him into prolonged states of depression. That letter, never made public, was found in his son's hand just hours after Paul died. If proven true, the revelation could shatter everything the public thought they knew about his final years. Paul Robeson had not only been silenced, isolated, and interrogated. He may have been quietly poisoned with pills that bore the stamp of legality. His death may not have come from age or illness alone, but from one of the most chilling, calculated psychological takedowns ever waged against a black artist in the 20th century. Perhaps in his final moments, Paul understood this, and that is why he didn't cry. He didn't scream. He left no elaborate will, only a letter, hidden away, like one final desperate cry in the dark. They say that days later, while clearing out his room at the Englewood mansion, Paul Jr. found a handwritten letter from his father tucked inside an Othello script. It was a whisper, captured in a few trembling lines. "If you ever return to Englewood, look closely at the living room. I left a dream there. Chai." So Paul Jr. wandered the living room, searching for the mystery his late father hinted at. Looking at the floor, where wooden tiles were neatly laid, he noticed a slightly uneven corner. Kneeling down, he traced the edge with his fingers, and after a moment's effort, a floor panel popped open. Beneath was a hidden compartment holding an ebony box, weathered, inscribed with the words, "Only truth sings forever." Inside, Paul Jr. found unreleased audio reels, unsent letters, drafts of speeches banned by the government, and a black notebook, Paul Robeson's handwritten diary from 1941 to 1949. In that notebook, some pages were faded, others torn out, but what remained was undeniable. Nights he heard strange footsteps in the house, times when friends vanished without warning, conflicting feelings about Islanda, his faith in the fight, and his greatest fear, losing his family to a cause too vast. At the bottom of the box was a smaller notebook, dated September 13, 1949, a day after the Peekskill riots. It held a single sentence, written in slanted ink. "I shouted to the world, but stayed silent with those I loved most." Paul Jr. closed the notebook, his hands trembling, knowing he had touched the deepest part of a legend. And from that day, the Englewood Mansion's living room was no longer just a space, but the keeper of Paul Robeson's final secret. A hidden corner of fatherhood, unfulfilled beliefs, and a dream left unspoken. When Paul Robeson took his last breath on January 23, 1976, he didn't leave behind the vast fortune people might have imagined. The man who conquered Broadway, spoke to thousands in Moscow, and silenced the world with Old Man River left less than $50,000 in his account, a few scattered music royalties, and a handful of worn personal items. The Englewood Mansion, the symbol of a black man's triumph in a racist America, was sold in the late 1940s to pay debts after years of government bans and a revoked passport. The small Harlem apartment, once a hub for activists, was gone. In his final years, Paul depended on his son and sister in a dilapidated Philadelphia home. The house was shuttered in 1972. At times, plans surfaced to demolish it for new housing, but each time, waves of protest rose up. Not for its antique architecture, but because every brick, every window frame carried the breath of a black man who dared to dream, fight, love, and lose. For many, it's a bitter end to a monumental life. But for Paul Robeson, perhaps nothing mattered more than his spiritual legacy. He once wrote, "If I had to choose between money and a voice, I'd choose the voice." And so he did, leaving not wealth, but a voice. A voice that still echoes in the Englewood Mansion's walls, in letters to Islanda, in unreleased recordings hidden in a secret floor compartment Paul Jr. uncovered. Paul Robeson was an icon not just of the Harlem Renaissance, but of unyielding human dignity. He broke barriers in art, sports, and politics, paving the way for names like Harry Belafonte, Ossie Davis, Sidney Poitier, and countless unnamed people still fighting today. In 1995, he was posthumously inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame. In 2023, on his 125th birthday, hundreds of events honored Paul across America, but for Paul Jr., his only child and final torchbearer, all tributes begin and end in one place, the Englewood Mansion, He spent his life preserving that memory, publishing the undiscovered Paul Robeson, archiving letters, recordings, and diaries at Howard University and other centers. With no children of his own, he left something greater, a promise to his father that the dream would not be forgotten. They say that in the Paul Robeson House Museum in Princeton, a small painting hangs in an old wooden frame, depicting the Englewood mansion under moonlight. It's the only painting Paul ever made of a house in darkness, yet always lit from within. If you ever pass through Englewood, New Jersey, and stumble upon an old mansion with peeling roof tiles, shuttered windows, and walls still bearing the faint carved words of a man who shook the world, I do not belong to a race. I belong to the human race. Would you stop? Paul Robeson's life wasn't just the tragedy of a misunderstood genius, but a mirror reflecting the sacrifices and losses people endure for an ideal. The unfinished dream in the Englewood mansion, the unreleased recordings, and the father-son bond never fully mended. What do you think of the legacy Paul left behind? A man who sang for all humanity but couldn't find the whisper meant just for his son. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe there's still something untold in that old mansion? And if you had the chance, would you dare open that door? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to catch our next journey.